As a comic nerd, the early 2010s were a dream come true for me. Marvel and DC both released long-anticipated adaptations and planned for many more. For fans of the medium, life was good. However, despite having iconic characters and a rich comic book history, DCEU's journey has been far more rocky than their neighbor across the pond and has ended in a little burning heap of bad decisions. As someone who was present for every turn in the story, it's downright disappointing to see how poorly managed my favorite fictional universe has turned out, and I don't know if I have it in me to forgive those responsible.
And that I do not forgive.
In this video, we'll discuss the mess that is DCEU and all the decisions that have led them to this point. In 2012, Marvel changed the landscape of Hollywood forever with the success of The Avengers. The studio's risky plan to give several superhero standalone movies that slowly converged into a crossover event paid off, producing one of the biggest blockbusters in history. The mouth-watering success of these movies, alongside the endless supply of source material, made this model super attractive to studios.
Oh, yeah.
And DC execs immediately saw the opportunity for a cash cow. 10 years and 13 movies later, that cash cow never really materialized, and only half the movies can be called successful. Warner Bros. Tested the waters with Man of Steel, a Superman reboot that was equal parts loved and hated. I personally don't think it was as dark as most of the famous criticisms at the time claimed. Snyder reintroduced the character in a modern world and depicted a first contact story of a pre-Superman Clark Kent that was complex and a bit hard to swallow. Man of Steel received mixed reviews, but its box office performance was solid and it gained a cult-like following. So DC moved ahead with the cinematic universe, and 10 movies were promised in 2014. This included a Man of Steel follow-up and a two-part Justice League movie directed by Snyder. Less than 3 years later, Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice was released. It was set in a world with an aging Batman, our budding Superman, and a scheming Lex Luthor, who was about to hatch an indestructible killer, Doomsday. It was a lot to fit in one movie, and following a lot of studio cuts, it was released to less than favorable reviews. It got some first-week box office records, but then it had a historic drop in its second week after critics got their hand on it. The Ultimate Edition was released much later, and was a longer and far more coherent story, but the damage had been done. What was supposed to be the cornerstone of the franchise was now a sloppy mess that they quickly wanted to forget. DC's next film was Suicide Squad, another movie that was very easy to dislike at the release. Following the negative reception of Batman vs Superman, the studio panicked at the dark R18 tone of Suicide Squad, and it had to undergo significant and hurried reshoots. It was, of course, a critical catastrophe. It should be pointed out that the criticism of these movies was always based on how they measured up with Marvel movies, and not really on their own merit. The Marvel way became the measure of success in movie discourse, and execs were paying attention. We never got to see what David Ayer's original movie looked like, but judging by BVS, it's safe to say it would have been more coherent than what we got. Soon after we were introduced to Wonder Woman, a movie I considered personally to be lukewarm, but now looks like one of their better projects in retrospect. The audience liked it, the critics liked it, and studios thought they'd found the winning formula. Warner Bros. Hired some shiny new execs to steer the DCEU toward their new direction. Around the same time, Snyder faced some personal tragedy and had to step away from the Justice League project. To fill that gap, the new execs decided to bring in Joss Whedon, the director of Avengers 1 and 2, to replicate the Avengers formula. A lighter tone, a few quips, some more color, and a plot upheaval later, they got the Justice League they wanted. It turned out to be complete garbage. It was disastrous for the DCEU. All the planned sequels and standalone origin movies were cancelled or put on hold, and Snyder's universe was dead as far as we knew. Shying away from that mess, DC planned to de-emphasize connections between movies, so the next DC films were largely standalone and not too connected to the Justice League world. Aquaman was made shortly after and it hit $1 billion, but left very little cultural imprint. Shazam was loved by critics, but then it was clear that all the films were separate entities. barely attached to the core story, which the studio did not know what to do with. A sinking ship. Wonder Woman and Harley Quinn couldn't repeat their magic for Wonder Woman 1984 and Birds of Prey. A third installment of Wonder Woman was actually announced, then publicly swept under the rug. Batgirl, a spin-off of Birds of Prey, was literally completed, then swept under the heaviest of rugs. That pissed off a lot of people, and even the core fans started to give up on the universe. After 4 years of fan pressure, the studio brought back Snyder for his cut of Justice League.
How did you get the house back from the bank?
I bought the bank.
And behold, it turned out to be several times better than the 2017 release. However, the studio had veered considerably from the path and considered the movie non-canon. Robert Pattinson's The Batman and Joaquin Phoenix's Joker were released around the same time, although they weren't set in the DCEU. Both stuck to the much maligned, dark and gritty tone, but both were critically and financially successful. While this was happening, Warner Bros. Decided to lean into their copy Marvel strategy and sanctioned a sequel or remake of Suicide Squad made by James Gunn, another MCU director. This one was well received, although to me it seemed like the run-of-the-mill Marvel movie with DC characters, which is fine, but it's a style that I personally have had quite enough of. But it was exactly what the studio was looking for. And not long after, Gunn was tacked on to oversee their new vision. With the Warner Bros. And Discovery merger in 2022, James Gunn and Peter Safran took charge of DC Studios, effectively declaring the end of the DCEU. Several DCEU films were released after, including The Flash, Black Adam, Blue Beetle, and a Shazam and Aquaman sequel. All, unfortunately, forgettable movies. And with that, DCEU ended with a whimper. So, what went wrong? First of all of this has been a practical guide on how not to run a movie studio. DC's response to Marvel's success led to a rushed, visionless cinematic universe. They wanted to do their own thing, but also wanted to do it the Marvel way. They wanted digestible, formulaic, and profitable fast food movies, and then hired directors known for their originality. In the end, it amounted to a lot of nothing. DC hadn't engendered the kind of brand loyalty that Marvel had at the time. So, it wasn't easy to get fans to just buy in. For core DC fans, the best DCEU movies had Zack Snyder at the front, but the Snyder movies also seemed to be designed to cater to just core fans, and people who walked into theaters with the Marvel experience in mind walked away disappointed. This was reflected in much of the criticism. I feel like a lot of it was overhanded and focused on the wrong things. This forced the studio to play safe, but it was clear that commercial success was the only goal of the decision makers at the time. The constant shakeups, from studio interference to leadership changes, created a really confusing universe. Walking into a DC movie, most people simply didn't know what they were going to get. While the start of the universe was a bit rocky, there was originality, a growing fanbase, and some box office progress. Warner Brothers, they disregarded all of that, undercutted their successful movies, and started to focus on peripheral projects. The only real headliner after Aquaman was Zack Snyder's Justice League, but it didn't matter. For Warner Brothers, it was about getting that Marvel Disney money, and so they were convinced the movies had to be done the Marvel Disney way. The release of the non-DCEU movies like Joker and The Batman led to critical and commercial success, but it confused both dedicated and casual fans, alienating them both. Despite the success of these two R-rated gritty movies, it never occurred to them, or the critics, that the tone was never really the problem. Controversial character choices and inconsistent portrayals eroded fan trust, but this was a direct consequence of constant studio interference and creative differences. In the end, fans were left questioning every creative choice. In truth, nobody's to blame but the studio. Panicking, short-sighted WB execs have been the problem of the franchise from the start, and I have no reason to believe that will change no matter how many times they reboot. In the end, DCEU were unable to overcome the lack of cohesive vision and studio turbulence that plagued it. The sum of the parts were always greater than the whole, and we may never know what the DCEU could have been. The studios are still capable of making great things, of course, but a lot of things just have to change. And they really have to listen to the fans to take the time to reach their audience this time.